Doopa 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 doopa. Wax and wane. It is 2 days after the release of the epic conclusion of Mistborn Era 2. I'm talking about the book The Lost Metal by Brandon Sanderson. I on this channel have been known to be a massive fan of Mistborn Era 2. I read it for the first time last year, fell in love with its uniqueness in the Cosmere and uniqueness in the current sort of vision of fantasy that's going on in the modern era. And I was fortunate enough to be able to reread this series in preparation for the Lost Metal's release for a read-along and set of live streams discussions that have been happening on Angela from the Literature Science Alliance's channel. And to say that I was anticipating the Lost Metal is an understatement. A huge one. While I loved reading Mistborn Era 2 the first time, absolutely loved it, rereading has allowed me to appreciate especially Shadows of Self so much more for being way more than the sum of its parts when it comes to the way that it is able to be a pulp, campy, action, mystery, weird reverse take on Batman that turns out to be way more thematically interesting and like thematically sound than you may have ever anticipated in a story with so many genitalia jokes. And The Lost Metal attempts to be the conclusion of Mistborn Era 2, but how well does it achieve that function? And ultimately, I think that is a bit of a mixed bag. It's not that I didn't enjoy the book, because I enjoyed the book greatly. I read it extremely quickly because it's very bingeable. These are characters I love in a style that I love, and there were many, many things to love about what was happening in this book, but when you analyze it as the conclusion of Mistborn Era 2, it starts to be a little bit middling with some of its successes, I would say. Mistborn Era 1 stands as one of the Cosmere's only finished pieces of work, and thus the conclusion of Mistborn Era 2 becomes one of the only examples of full completed Cosmere Era trilogy sections with one of the worlds or whatever that we've seen from Brandon Sanderson, and the way that he wraps it up is, like I said, it's a mixed bag. But I think that there's multiple ways you can approach, did he actually wrap up Mistborn Era 2 well? On one hand, there's the aspect of the character arcs. The characters are very much exponentially exaggerated versions of comic book heroes in a pulp action setting. How well did they fulfill their character arcs? And even that is a difficult question, because the thing about pulp action is that the characters don't always have to go through an arc to be interesting. We have seen the characters in Mistborn Era 2 grow, and especially in Book 2, The Shadows of Self of Mistborn Era 2, we get to see a lot of internal character philosophizing. But the point stands that unlike Mistborn Era 1, where we started with characters that were a very unskilled, uncoordinated set of people, in Mistborn Era 2, we are starting with a competency level that's quite high, and we're starting, after the characters have been working together for a very long time, relationships have already been established between many of the characters, and though we get to see the ways that new relationships are formed, and those can grow, there's a lot more set in stone in Mistborn Era 2 than there was in Mistborn Era 1. And as I said before, Shadows of Self really set up a lot of character arcs on their way. And in that sense, from a technical level at least, most of the character arcs get very satisfying conclusions in Mistborn Era 2. I say in a technical sense because the success or failure of those attempts on paper works, though in practicality, it was hit or miss. I think ultimately this comes down to execution with the way that Brandon Sanderson chose to wrap up many of the storylines, where it's going to be a very subjective thing. Some people will love it, some people will hate it. I fell in the middle where I liked it in some ways and didn't like it in others. I can't really break into it too much in a spoiler-free discussion, though I am taking part in multiple spoiler-filled discussions of this book. Stay tuned to the channel or the Discord or the social medias to be able to see when those events are happening. But the point stands that even in the longest Mistborn Era 2 book that we have, it still felt like parts of the plot were rushed. Like, because this was the last book, there were character arcs that were supposed to happen that didn't necessarily get the amount of time that I wish they had, which is weird because we've had 4 books to do them. And ultimately, the characters aren't growing as epically as they do in other Brandon Sanderson series even. All this combined leaves me thinking, if you were here for the character growth of the characters and you're really focused on the character side of Mistborn Era 2, there is a lot to love about The Lost Metal. There's a lot I loved about The Lost Metal. Now we can talk about another one of the elephants in the room. Outside of the actual book itself, Brandon Sanderson and much of the community has been building up hype for The Lost Metal because it was known to be one of the most Cosmere-aware books that we've seen so far, and that turns out to be true. I don't really think it's that big of a spoiler to say that the thing that the author said was going to happen happens in the book. It's very Cosmere aware. So if you're a fan of the Cosmere and not just Mistborn, and especially not just Mistborn Era 2, there are a lot of nuggets to chew on. And when I say nuggets to chew on, I just mean he throws a lot of straight things right in your face. It's a lot less hidden than it has been in the past. This includes things like Rhythm of War, where we thought we were getting a lot of Cosmere aware content. This is very much even more of the forefront than we've ever seen before. And that is awesome. As someone that loves the Cosmere, it's super cool to finally be seeing a lot of this stuff pay off in a way that I've wanted to see pay off for a very long time. I don't think that anyone that loves the Cosmere is going to complain about the Cosmere type stuff we see in this book. That is as close to an objective statement as I could possibly do in a review of art. So on that front, this book totally delivers. Now let's talk about another point of conflict that makes this book. Now let's talk about the main point that makes this book really hard to make a final judgment on. In Mistborn Era 1, the conclusion that happens is the conclusion of a 3-book story that takes place over a very long time. We saw tons of growth with those characters, as I mentioned before. I want to say it's like a decade of time between book 1 and book 3, with segments taking place between each book, and each book has a very different flair and flavor for the era that is the world itself evolving over the course of that series. And because of the plot of that series being very focused on something very specific at all times, it's always known what the big bad is. And when the conclusion of that story happens, even though you don't get every single answer, it feels like you have concluded a story. It feels very final in a way that is satisfying, even if it's emotionally taxing. The major rub with Mistborn Era 2 is that while we do, from book 1, have a very specific end goal for the quadrilogy, the scope of said goal changes drastically based on the Mistborn Era 2 book that we are reading at the time. By the end of the Bands of Mourning, the big bad has escalated to massive, epic proportions. And here, once again, the Lost Metal technically delivers and succeeds at answering the questions you might have about the final confrontation that happens in this book. Technically speaking, it concludes and answers exactly what it promises. For some people, that's going to be too big of a spoiler. For those people, do you even know how books work? The problem, though, the biggest problem is, I think that while The Lost Metal answers so many questions so well in a way that will please the fans, it also leaves so many things unanswered, and certain storylines end on such a soft landing that this hardly feels like an actual conclusion more than the middle part of a trilogy. And I think most readers will know exactly what I'm talking about. There's always the middle book in a trilogy syndrome where it feels like, yeah, you technically wrap some things up, but also a lot of things did not get finished, and I now need the sequel to actually get the conclusion of this story. This book ends with a series of epilogues covering the final bits of many of these characters' stories, but in my opinion, they just don't feel all that final. And of course, Brandon Sanderson has said for a very long time that there's going to be 2 more eras of Mistborn. And one of those Mistborn is supposed to take place in like a modern era. But this book feels like it doesn't actually cap off the era that you want it to, even though technically it does. And that is hard to express specifically without going into spoilers. All of those things being said, I had a blast with this one. It still was a ton of fun. The actual major mystery plot that we're dealing with is very followable, even if somewhat predictable. Like, this might be the most predictable Brandon Sanderson book that I've maybe ever read, which is not inherently to say that's flawed. It just is. Many of the plot points of this book are predictable in ways that I don't think Brandon Sanderson's other works usually are. Like, usually I feel like plot twists are his thing, but nearly every single plot point of this one I sort of predicted along the way. And it's, of course, I'm following the clues that he's giving me. It's not like he's not giving me the clues to follow, but it's weird knowing all the story beats before the characters in a Brandon Sanderson book. Story beats that are awesome, with character moments that are awesome. We get some amazing, perfect character moments exactly like what we wanted to, which sometimes getting exactly what you wanted instead of being surprised can be slightly disappointing. Sometimes the execution is amazing and these story beats really hit me and I felt things, and sometimes they felt a little bit more rote, and I don't know if that's because they weren't surprising, or because they're exactly what I expected, or because the actual delivery of said scene was not as good as I wished it was. It's hard to know. But if I had to make a prediction about what the lasting impression of The Lost Metal will be, it will be one specific plot point that happens within The Lost Metal that's related to Mistborn Era 2, and almost every single one of the staying pieces of Mistborn Era 2 that people will remember going forward outside of one specific story beat will be everything else related to the Cosmere, what this means for the Cosmere at large, what this means for Mistborn Era 3 and the importance of the Cosmere workings. With that, I think the conclusion of this story is ultimately going to be forgotten, largely due to being overshadowed by the Cosmere implications of the story instead of the actual execution, nailing finale of a story with characters that I love so much. Like I said, on paper it works, but I think that maybe by giving us so much of the ooey gooey goodness of the cookies that we wanted with the Cosmere juice, maybe we didn't get the vegetables of the conclusion of Mistborn Era 2 the way that I maybe wanted. I hope that I'm not alone here, and I'm not trying to bash it, because I did love the book. But upon reflecting on it, I'm very conflicted about many aspects of the delivery, the way things were handled. Were you generally a fan of Mistborn Era 2, or did you just read Mistborn Era 2 because you need to know what's happening in the Cosmere? That might ultimately make one of my cases. If you finish the book and you're commenting things about spoilers, please mark your comments as spoilers. You can even type a comment, hit enter a bunch of times, and then type your comment, and it will actually be below a thing that people have to click through to see the spoilers. Additionally, if you want to talk spoilers in detail, you can come over to my Discord, which is linked down below. There are many Cosmere and Brandon Sanderson channels, some for spoilers, some for not spoilers. But the release of a new Cosmere book is always a great and amazing time to theorize with your friends. But yeah, what do you guys think of my criticisms and analysis of the way that this book handles finishing Mistborn Era 2 out? If you'd like to see my thoughts on other Cosmere related material or other fantasy, mystery, paranormal, science fiction, whatever in general, please consider subscribing to the channel. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I can't wait to see you again soon. Until next time, goodbye.
No, I never get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep. No, I never get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired. Sleep. No, I never get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep. No, I never get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired.